Imagine a world where Europe was struggling through wars, plagues, and political chaos. Yet thousands of kilometers away, across deserts so vast that even the bravest travelers feared them, there existed a city whose name alone inspired awe. A city whose streets shimmered with gold dust carried by the desert wind, whose markets overflowed with goods from Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, and whose scholars debated science and philosophy at a level Europe wouldn't reach for centuries. This wasn't a legend or a myth. This was Timbuktu, the crown jewel of the Mali Empire. But the true power of Timbuktu wasn't just its wealth, it was its mystery. To Europeans of the Middle Ages, the Sahara was a wall, a barrier of heat and death. Hardly anyone crossed it. So when stories emerged of a city richer than Paris, more educated than Rome, and more peaceful than London, no one believed them. How could a city in dark Africa, as Europeans ignorantly called it, hold more gold than entire European kingdoms combined? How could a city in the desert thrive when European capitals were struggling to survive? And above all, what kind of ruler could build such an empire? This is where the story becomes even more unbelievable, because the Mali Empire wasn't ruled by an ordinary king. It was ruled by Mansa Musa, a man so wealthy that historians still cannot calculate the true scale of his fortune. His wealth wasn't measured in coins or land. It was measured in entire, gold-producing regions, countless mines, and control of trade routes that connected 3 continents. Some writers say he owned roughly half of the old world's gold supply, not as rumor, but as everyday reality. But behind this unimaginable wealth lies the real question. How did Timbuktu rise from a desert outpost to the intellectual and economic capital of medieval Africa? And why did this city, once known across continents, become nearly erased from mainstream history? Stay with this story, because every next chapter reveals a hidden truth the world never told you. Long before Mansa Musa's rule, Timbuktu began as a tiny settlement built by Tuareg nomads near a life-giving curve of the Niger River. Nothing about it suggested that it would one day become richer than any European capital, but its location held a secret advantage. It sat at the exact crossroads of the trans-Saharan trade routes, the ancient highways where caravans of up to 10,000 camels marched for months, carrying salt from the Sahara, textiles from North Africa, and gold from the forests of West Africa. This trade was brutal. Travelers crossed endless dunes, deadly heat, and bandit-ridden paths. Many never returned. But those who made it to Timbuktu reached a paradise for merchants, a place where the markets never slept. The demand never ended and the profits seemed limitless. Salt, a mineral often more valuable than gold in the medieval world, arrived in blocks that weighed more than a man. Gold came in baskets, nuggets, dust, and bricks. Perfumes from Egypt, silk from Morocco, manuscripts from Arabia, weapons, iron, glass beads, medicine, spices, everything passed through Timbuktu's gates. And here lies the twist that surprises most people. The true foundation of Timbuktu's wealth wasn't physical gold, it was knowledge. Merchants didn't just trade goods. They traded ideas, mathematics, astronomy, languages, and theology. Thousands of manuscripts were copied by hand. Teachers traveled from distant lands to lecture in its open-air universities. Students came from across Africa to study philosophy, law, geography, and medicine. Europe at that same time was losing manuscripts in wars, burning books in religious conflicts, and struggling with literacy. But in Timbuktu, paper was a luxury. Books were investments, and scholars were treated like royalty. A single manuscript could be worth a house. A library could be worth a fortune. But the greatest twist? Even with all this wealth and knowledge, the city hadn't yet reached its golden age. That transformation would come when a king like no other stepped onto the world stage. When Mansa Musa inherited the throne of the Mali Empire, the world was about to witness something it had never seen before. Musa wasn't just a king, he was a strategist, a builder, a scholar, and a visionary. He understood something other rulers ignored. Wealth without purpose disappears. So instead of hoarding gold, he expanded mines, secured trade routes, strengthened armies, and invested in cities that would define his legacy, especially Timbuktu. His power became legendary during his 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca, This journey, meant to be a spiritual act, turned into a display of wealth that stunned the world. Musa traveled with 60,000 men, including soldiers, scholars, officials, and servants. 12,000 slaves walked beside him, each holding a gold staff. 80 camels carried hundreds of kilograms of gold each. Wherever he stopped, he built mosques. Wherever he passed, he handed out gold freely, so freely that the price of gold crashed across Egypt, crippling the economy for a decade. But Musa didn't care about showing off. His goal was bigger: to put Mali, and especially Timbuktu, on the world map. He invited architects from Cairo, scholars from Arabia, and traders from distant kingdoms to come to Mali. He ordered the construction of great mosques, learning centers, libraries, and universities. Under his command, Timbuktu became the cultural heartbeat of the empire, a place where wealth and wisdom blended so perfectly that it became the medieval world's greatest intellectual city. What makes this story even more unbelievable is that almost every detail you're hearing is recorded in historical documents, not legends, not fantasies, but real accounts from Arab scholars, travelers, merchants, and even European observers. And still, we have only scratched the surface of what Timbuktu truly became. When Mansa Musa returned from Mecca, he didn't return alone. He brought back architects, engineers, scholars, builders, poets, and teachers who would reshape Timbuktu forever. Among them was the legendary architect Abu Ishaq es-Saheli, a man whose knowledge of North African architecture would redefine West African cities. Under Mansa Musa's command, es-Saheli designed the iconic Jingwereber Mosque, a masterpiece of mud, wood, limestone, and desert engineering. Its walls thick enough to trap cool air, its towers rising like golden peaks against the burning sky. To build it, Musa paid es-Saheli what would be the equivalent of millions of dollars in gold today. This was just the beginning. Musa funded the construction of madrasas, learning centers where scholars taught mathematics, astronomy, jurisprudence, grammar, poetry, medicine, geography, and theology. Timbuktu became the intellectual capital of Africa, a city where anyone who hungered for knowledge could rise to greatness. Families began competing to build libraries, collecting manuscripts the way European nobles collected jewels. It is recorded that Timbuktu grew to hold over 700,000 manuscripts, making it one of the world's greatest literary treasure cities. But beneath all this beauty and progress, something even more powerful was happening. Timbuktu was becoming the spiritual center of West Africa. Students walked the streets reciting lessons. Scholars gathered under desert trees, debating the movement of stars and the meaning of ancient texts. Mansa Musa's wealth didn't just build buildings, it built minds. And in a world where knowledge meant power, this made Timbuktu unstoppable. For now. Yet, in the shadows of this golden era, distant powers had begun watching, jealous, suspicious, hungry. Because when a city shines too bright, the world's greed begins to awaken. To understand Timbuktu's true power, you must imagine its markets as they were, oceans of sound, color, spices, fragrances, and wealth. Traders from Ghana, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, Nubia, Algeria, and beyond gathered here. Caravans arrived after months of peril, led by camel drivers whose faces were hardened by desert winds. The first sight of Timbuktu, sparkling under the sun, felt like a promise of survival. The marketplace was divided into quarters, each one a universe of its own. One area bustled with the trade of salt slabs, prized like diamonds. Another overflowed with textiles bright as the desert sky. Gold dust glittered in the air as merchants waited on delicate brass scales. Perfumes from Arabia filled the streets. African ivory glowed under the sun. Manuscripts bound in leather lay stacked like precious treasure. But the most shocking fact? Books were more expensive than gold. This wasn't a rumor. This was recorded by medieval travelers like Leo Africanus. A rare manuscript could cost more than a horse, a house, or even a caravan. The reason? Timbuktu valued the mind over metal. Scholars were society's elite. Knowledge was seen as the purest form of wealth. At the same time, the Mali Empire commanded the desert like a kingdom of shadows. Soldiers patrolled borders, protecting gold mines and trade routes. The empire's reach extended across rivers, forests, plains, and dunes. No merchant could cross West Africa without passing through Mali and without paying taxes to its king. This system brought unimaginable wealth. Gold flowed like water, caravans moved like armies, and the entire world began whispering of a city where everything, from ideas to gold itself, was limitless. But every empire that rises too fast carries within it a seed of danger. The envy of nations who cannot bear to watch another shine, and that danger was coming. While the world obsessed over Mali's gold, the true treasure of Timbuktu was being protected quietly, inside mud-walled libraries, wooden chests, and rooms filled with the soft scent of ancient paper. Students walked barefoot to avoid raising dust. Scholars spent nights copying manuscripts by candlelight, dipping pens into ink made from desert plants. They wrote about mathematics, astronomy, physics, medicine, navigation, ethics, law, poetry, and philosophy. The center of this intellectual explosion was the Sankora University, a place so advanced that historians compare it to Oxford, Al-Azhar, and the great centers of learning in Baghdad. Sankora wasn't just a building, it was a living universe. Teachers did not lecture from a podium. They sat with students in circles, teaching from memory, debate, and manuscript study. Students' rank wasn't based on age, it was based on how deeply they could think. Travelers recorded scenes almost impossible to believe. Libraries storing tens of thousands of manuscripts, private collectors owning more books than entire European monasteries, scholars debating the geometry of stars while Europe struggled with famine and war. The scholars of Timbuktu studied astronomy so deeply that some manuscripts describe the movement of planets with astonishing accuracy. Others detail medical treatments, surgical techniques, mathematical theories, and maps of the African continent drawn centuries before. European explorers arrived, but hidden among these manuscripts were secrets the world wasn't ready for, knowledge that threatened foreign powers who wanted to claim Africa as a blank, uneducated land. Timbuktu's brilliance didn't fit their narrative. And so, as the centuries passed, enemies began to circle. Some wanted its gold. Some wanted its knowledge. Some wanted its destruction. The Golden City would soon face its darkest hours. As Timbuktu glowed brighter, the shadows around it grew darker. The world beyond the Sahara had begun to change. Europe, once fractured and weak, was slowly rising from medieval chaos. Kingdoms were expanding, merchants were hungry for new wealth, and explorers were dreaming of lands filled with gold. Word of Timbuktu's riches, its libraries, its gold markets, its scholars, spread like wildfire. Some didn't believe it, some feared it, but others wanted it. North African powers, especially the Moroccan Sultanate, stared across the desert with increasing envy. For centuries, Morocco had relied on trade from the south. Caravans brought gold into its cities, fueling its economy. But as Mali and later Songhai grew stronger, Morocco's influence weakened. Its rulers began to resent how much control West African empires held over the world's gold supply. European merchants, too, heard rumors from Arab travelers of a city where gold was as common as grain. They imagined streets paved in gold, households filled with treasure, and kings richer than any European ruler. Some European maps of the 14th and 15th centuries even mark West Africa with drawings of Mansa Musa holding a giant gold nugget, proof that his legend had traveled across oceans. But while outsiders dreamed of Timbuktu's wealth, they misunderstood something crucial. Timbuktu didn't display its treasure openly. It hid it. The gold didn't lie in streets. It lay in the empire's control of trade routes, its mines, its scholars, and its knowledge of geography, astronomy, and the desert itself. Yet the more outsiders tried to understand Timbuktu, the more frustrated they became. How was a city in Africa, an Africa they wrongly assumed to be primitive, richer, and smarter than Europe? This jealousy would soon transform into aggression, because when knowledge threatens power, power fights back. After the death of Mansa Musa, Mali did not collapse immediately, but the empire began to shift. Successors lacked his vision and control. Provinces rebelled. Trade routes became harder to secure. Slowly, the empire's borders shrank. And Timbuktu, though still wealthy, became vulnerable. And then came the rise of a new power, the Songhai Empire. Songhai's leaders understood the importance of Timbuktu. They knew its gold and knowledge could transform their kingdom into a world superpower. And that is exactly what they did. Under Sunni Ali, Songhai's armies conquered Timbuktu. His rule was harsh, and scholars felt threatened. But the city still survived because its intellectual roots were too deep to die from a single storm. The real transformation came under Askia Muhammad, a ruler who valued scholars like living treasure. Under his leadership, Timbuktu re-entered a golden age. Libraries grew larger, scholars gained influence, and the city's prestige spread across Africa once again. Under Songhai rule, trade expanded and caravans increased in number. Timbuktu became the center of law, science, mathematics, medicine, and theology. The Sankore University reached its peak, producing some of Africa's most extraordinary minds, including Ahmed Baba, a scholar who would later become the symbol of Timbuktu's intellectual resilience. But as Songhai grew stronger, Morocco grew desperate. Its economy depended heavily on Saharan trade, and its rulers feared that Songhai was becoming too powerful, controlling too much gold, too much knowledge, too much influence. So in the shadows of Morocco's palaces, a dangerous plan began to form, one that would bring devastation to Timbuktu. In the year 1591, Morocco launched one of the most shocking military campaigns in African history. Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur sent an army across the Sahara, an army equipped with guns, muskets, and cannons, weapons the Songhai Empire had never faced before. The desert should have killed them. The heat should have destroyed them. The distance should have stopped them. But greed drives men to survive the impossible. After months of suffering, the Moroccan forces reached the Niger River in a brutal and tragic battle at Tondibi. The Songhai army, brave but armed with spears, arrows, and swords, faced Moroccan gunpowder. The result was devastating. The empire that once controlled half of West Africa began to crumble. And then Morocco marched into Timbuktu. The golden city that had dazzled the world stood silent under foreign occupation. Moroccan soldiers stormed libraries, seized scholars, and searched desperately for the legendary mountains of gold they believed were hidden in the city. But they found nothing, because Timbuktu's gold was never in its streets. It was in its trade networks, its people, its mines. Out of frustration, Moroccan forces arrested Timbuktu's greatest scholar, Ahmed Baba, and exiled him to Morocco. When soldiers entered his home, expecting piles of treasure, they were stunned. Ahmed Baba looked at them and said, "The only wealth I own is my books." The Moroccans seized 1,600 of his manuscripts, one of the largest personal libraries in the world at that time. This was not just the fall of a city, it was the attempted execution of a civilization's memory. But even in its darkest hour, Timbuktu refused to die. When Moroccan forces occupied Timbuktu, the city's people understood something terrifying. Their books were in more danger than their gold. The invaders did not understand the value of manuscripts. They only searched for physical treasure. But the scholars knew that if the manuscripts were seized, erased, or burned, centuries of African science, mathematics, astronomy, law, medicine, geography, and philosophy would disappear forever. So the people of Timbuktu made a decision that would become one of the greatest acts of intellectual resistance in history. They began hiding their books. Not a few, not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Families buried manuscripts inside clay pots. Scholars hid them under floors, in walls in underground rooms, and in secret chambers of mosques. Some manuscripts were placed in wooden trunks and buried near the Niger River, carefully sealed to survive moisture. Others were smuggled out of the city in donkey carts disguised as grain shipments. Entire families risked their lives to protect a single book. Because in Timbuktu, a manuscript was not paper. It was identity. It was memory. It was civilization. And here is the heartbreaking twist. Even as the city's gold was stolen, its people silently protected the treasure the invaders could not. Understand knowledge. For centuries after the invasion, Timbuktu's libraries remained hidden, passed down through families who guarded them as sacred inheritance. Some manuscripts were so valuable that people would refuse to sell them even when starving. The world had no idea that in the sands of Mali, far from European libraries and academies, Africa's intellectual heritage was being preserved by ordinary people fighting against oblivion. It is one of the greatest and least known acts of cultural survival in world history. The Moroccan invasion shattered the political power of Timbuktu, but it did not kill the city's soul. For centuries that followed, the city endured hardship, economic decline, changing trade routes, colonial pressures, and environmental challenges. Caravans became fewer. Empires changed hands. New borders were drawn by foreign powers who had no understanding of African history. But through every era of decline, Timbuktu held on to one thing: its knowledge. Scholars continued to teach quietly in courtyards and small mosques. Families copied manuscripts by hand, passing them to the next generation. Young students memorized the words of ancient scholars by candlelight, even as the world outside grew hostile. European explorers who visited Timbuktu in the 19th century expected to find gold-filled streets. Instead, they found a city battered by time but still pulsing with scholarship. Manuscripts were still being read. Libraries, small, hidden, but alive, still, held documents centuries older than Europe's oldest printed books. The city had become poorer in wealth, but richer in resilience. And then, in the 20th century, something remarkable happened. Historians, archaeologists, and researchers began to realize that Timbuktu was not just an African treasure, it was a global treasure. Its manuscripts revealed details about African astronomy that challenged Western assumptions. Its medical texts documented surgeries, herbal treatments, and theories unknown outside Africa. Its maps and geographic writings proved that West Africans had charted vast regions long before European colonizers claimed to discover them. Slowly, the world began to understand a truth that had been buried under centuries of bias. Africa had a written intellectual tradition as rich as any on earth. And at the heart of that tradition, beaten, occupied, forgotten, but never destroyed, stood Timbuktu. In recent decades, historians and researchers began uncovering something extraordinary. The hidden libraries of Timbuktu were real and far more massive than anyone imagined. Families who had guarded manuscripts for generations began bringing them forward. Some arrived holding wooden chests, filled with documents handwritten by their ancestors. Others opened clay pots sealed for centuries. What they found shocked the world. More than 700,000 manuscripts in history, medicine, mathematics, law, astronomy, literature, geometry, agriculture, and philosophy survived. Not because governments protected them, not because armies saved them, but because the people of Timbuktu refused to let them die. The manuscripts contained astronomical charts showing planetary movements. They described complex medical procedures. They detailed agricultural methods, rainfall patterns, navigational techniques, and legal systems older than many European kingdoms. Some documents even debated the ethics of war, human rights, and governance centuries before European Enlightenment thinkers. Timbuktu, once dismissed as legend, had finally forced the world to confront reality. This was not a city of sand and myth. It was one of the most important intellectual centers in human history. But as the world celebrated this rediscovery, a new danger began to rise, a danger that threatened to repeat history. Modern extremist groups began advancing toward Timbuktu, and once again, the people would be forced to fight for their heritage, not with weapons, but with courage. For centuries, Timbuktu's manuscripts slept safely in hidden rooms, clay pots, and family libraries. But in 2012, a new nightmare arrived. Armed extremist groups swept across northern Mali, seizing city after city. When they reached Timbuktu, the world watched in fear, not because of the city's gold this time, but because of its knowledge. These groups saw the manuscripts as threats, labeling them forbidden, even though they represented the peaceful heart of Islamic learning and African history. They began burning libraries, smashing heritage sites, and destroying ancient tombs. Smoke rose over the desert, and people thought the legacy of Timbuktu would finally be lost forever. But then something miraculous happened. Another heroic act that echoed the bravery of Timbuktu's ancestors. Ordinary citizens, librarians, teachers, and families united in absolute secrecy, working at night, risking their lives. They smuggled more than 350,000 manuscripts out of Timbuktu. They carried them in rice sacks, metal boxes, and even fruit crates. They moved them through checkpoints, across rivers, and into safe houses. Every step could have meant death, but they kept going, because they understood one truth that outsiders never could. If Timbuktu's knowledge died, a part of Africa's soul would die with it. Their courage saved one of humanity's greatest treasures again. This was the second great rescue in Timbuktu's history, proving that while empires fall, people with purpose never surrender. Today, historians look at Timbuktu not as a myth, not as a legend, but as a correction to the world's misunderstanding of Africa. For too long, textbooks painted Africa as a dark continent, ignoring the brilliance that existed long before Europe's rise. But Timbuktu stands as living evidence that Africa once led the world in science. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, architecture, literature, and governance. Its libraries proved Africa had universities when Europe was still rebuilding after the fall of Rome. Its scholars proved that Africans debated law, ethics, astronomy, and medicine centuries before other continents caught up. And its kings, especially Mansa Musa, showed that wealth can build minds, not just palaces. Mali's gold reshaped the medieval world, but Timbuktu's knowledge reshaped the future. Even today, researchers are still studying manuscripts copied hundreds of years ago, discovering new mathematical theories, new astronomical observations, and new insights into African civilizations. This alone destroys every stereotype the world once believed. Timbuktu's story teaches us that the desert is not empty, Africa is not silent, and history is not what conquerors write, it is what survivors protect. And so, the story ends where it began, with a city in the desert whose light refused to die. Timbuktu was richer than European capitals, not just in gold, but in ideas. It survived invasions, betrayal, colonial rewriting, economic collapse, extremist destruction, and centuries of silence. Yet it stands today as one of humanity's greatest achievements. Because Timbuktu was never just a place, it was a movement of scholars who believed knowledge was sacred, a movement of kings who built empires with wisdom, a movement of families who risked everything to guard their books, a movement of people who understood that civilizations die when their stories are forgotten. Timbuktu's survival proves one timeless truth. Gold can vanish, empires can fall, armies can burn cities, but knowledge, when protected by the brave, can outlive time itself. This is the true story of the medieval African city richer than European capitals. This is the legacy of Mansa Musa's empire, and this is the miracle of Timbuktu, a city that refused to disappear.